Hi, my name is Dr. Elina Telford and I'm a registered clinical psychologist with the HCPC. I really want to talk about the topic of pro-anorexia. Now you might be asking, why is that even relevant? Why is a psychologist talking about this subject? Well, quite simply, one person dies every 52 minutes from an eating disorder. What we know is that there is up to 3.4 million people within the UK with an eating disorder and 25% of those are male. Since the pandemic, the number of eating disorders have risen within the UK. Prior to the pandemic, about 0.8% of 17 to 19-year-olds self-reported they had an eating disorder. That's increased to 12.5%. Eating disorders are a serious medical crisis, and the internet has a role in the onset and maintenance for some young people in their eating disorders. So what is pro-anorexia? Now, I find this really fascinating, and possibly because I'm a little bit boring and did do a research PhD on this subject. So I think it is important for the purpose of context to get a sense of its history. Now, alarmingly, pro-anorexia has been around for 25 years. That's like quarter of a century. In the late 90s, pro-anorexic websites started emerging on the internet. Now, these typically came with a disclaimer, not quite a trigger warning, but a disclaimer, so we're quite alluring. And actually what we know now about disclaimers and trigger warnings on websites is that they can actually entice people in. A psychological reference might be around the forbidden fruit. So you see that and you're like, I might going to have a look at that. And specifically if you've got a vulnerability to or an interest in eating, changing your body weight and shape, and maybe some eating disorder psychopathology. Once you got through the button of OK, you were opened up into a new world, and the new world was quite striking at that time in that you were presented with a range of emaciated images. There were click functions within there, so you would click on maybe Anna's 10 Commandments, which basically referenced and discussed 10 rules, 10 ideologies about what a good anorexic might be doing. So thou shalt feel guilty when one eats, for example. That was accompanied with FATSPO, so inspirational images designed to maybe cause a sense of repulsion around people's body weight and shape. Now, one of the interesting things about that is that FATSPO wasn't being derogatory towards obese people, but it was identifying typical healthy weight people and saying, actually, this isn't an okay ideal. Instead, come and look at our Thinspiration, and this is something instead you should be striving towards. And often the Thinspiration was kind of the waif models at the time, but also doctored images. And I think one of the key differences between now and the late 90s is possibly people weren't quite alert to the way that images could be doctored, because actually we hadn't been exposed to this form of media before. Within those websites, you'd find lots of tips and tricks. So typically the tips and tricks would be things like how you might hide your illness from health professionals, ways to become thinner, ideas around engaging in eating disordered behaviours. So for example, tips and tricks on how to vomit, maybe how to manage feeling cold, maybe laxative use, diuretic use, and diet pill use. So it really was a forum of information which normalised and promoted eating disorders. It was very much a pro-illness message rather than a pro-recovery message. And within that there were subcultures. So you had pro-ana, for people who identified more as anorexic, and also pro-Maya, which referenced the pro-bulimia movement at the time. Interestingly, that's never picked up as much traction, and I suspect that relates to people's ideas and beliefs around bulimia, and often people feeling a greater sense of shame and stigma related to vomiting and binge purge behaviours. Since that time, the internet has evolved massively. And what we look at now is very, very different to what we looked at in the past. So whilst those messages still remain, they're presented very differently. So if you think about a very traditional website, it was very much around you having to search for it, you clicking on buttons and things just popping up. They were often lacked an element of interaction. Since that time, social media has evolved, and also the way we access the information has evolved. So I think there are two significant changes here. One is the amount of time and the accessibility we have to screens and social media, which potentially include these messages, and two, the way the images are displayed and the way we interact with the world. Now, what we see now in pro-anorexic communities is that the content is very similar. Some of the labels have evolved, so you might hear now skinny TikTok, I think is very much a new wave of pro-anorexia, a new language, possibly developed to help people evade being kind of deleted by the platforms that people use. but they still convey the same messages. They are still a series of images with a number of summaries which promote that ideal of thinness, an ideal of unhealthiness, and danger, effectively. And I think one of the challenges of pro-anorexia is that the language has transcended into mainstream language too. So the concept of clean eating, I'm not saying was derived from pro-anorexia, but certainly came off the back of pro-anorexia. And also language such as Thinspiration, Fitspiration, that's very much in current cultural social media language. So whilst we can recognise that pro-anorexia might sit over there, there absolutely are traits within our mainstream media use. And one of the challenges is that we're also all organised by the algorithm. Now, an algorithm didn't exist in the way that it did back in the 90s, so once we start clicking on this information, the more information we get back. And that creates something called an echo chamber. So the more we seek out something, the more we get back. And it kind of reinforces and normalises, but also encourages and incites behaviour. And we see this in lots of different areas, be it around self-harm or suicide, but this is specifically prevalent in eating disorders. I think often what people say to me is pro-anorexic communities only impact a small number of people. And I would argue that's partially true in that when we start seeking out that information, we're probably seeking out that information from a place of insecurity. Maybe if we're feeling a bit anxious or cautious about our body, we might be looking at other images to either inspire us or compare ourselves. Now, Fessinger talked about a upward comparison. So when we see somebody more favourable, we often kind of lower our own views of ourselves. So the more we look at somebody, the worse we feel about ourselves, and the more we want to become like that person. And you absolutely see that in those toxic cultures within pro-anorexic communities. And one of the challenges is the interaction that people have. So you also get a community of competition, of real life competition. And if we think about that competition in isolation, where you haven't got people kind of challenging those views, that can become exceptionally dangerous. And I'll never forget when doing my research PhD, sitting with one young lady doing an interview about her experience. And she told me how she had been encouraged to lose weight and she had engaged in some behaviours to enable her to vomit. In that moment, we just took a pause in that interview, and I kind of felt her world break in front of me, because in that moment, what happened for her is that she ruptured her esophagus. Those conversations online caused a real life event where she almost died. And she was able to get medical help, and she was able to come to the interview and tell me about this experience. But what it showed me is that not only was the information that she was learning was super, super dangerous and actually life-threatening, but it also taught me that actually, had she not had this online experience, she probably wouldn't have got to this position. She wouldn't have learnt that information, and nobody in her real physical world would have encouraged her to do something that extreme. And I think for me as a clinician, that's one of the dangers of pro-anorexia, is that it creates a community away from public gaze. You're in a secret world, which is so alluring, and it's how wonderful is it to have a group of like-minded people who get you. I mean, I think as having talked to many pro-anorexic users, I can absolutely see the value of having a group of like-minded people who understand your challenges, who get how consuming an eating disorder is. Like, it consumes people to the extent that not only are they thinking about every meal, they're thinking about every movement, they're thinking about how they sit in a chair, how they look in that reflection, how they look in that reflection, what that person is thinking, but it's in their dreams, whether they're not eating, whether they're vomiting, whether they're going to be the right size. Like, is it okay to wake up because I can't face the next day? It just encroaches on every element of life. And of course, having people who get you must feel so good when life feels that awful or that challenging and stuck. Yeah, as a clinician, it's really, really hard when people start engaging in those communities, because not only is it normalising, but it creates conversations away from the professional, where I can't challenge that because that world is so secretive and private, and often people don't want to talk about it because they're deeply ashamed, because there's part of them that knows that what they're talking about probably isn't socially acceptable. As a clinician, I'm always asking about pro-anorexia and then internet use, but only a handful of people will come forward and tell me about that. And in fact, often the people who tell me most about it are the people who have come out of inpatient settings, where actually some of them have created their own subcultures of pro-ana, where they use their own phones and their own social medias to compete and talk about how they're progressing or not progressing with their illness. When people do talk about their internet use, they often just talk a sense of feeling trapped. So whilst they feel supported on one hand, they also feel trapped. And I think a challenge can be is that often, like lots of people with anorexia nervosa, they can be very protective of other people around them. They want people to think good of them. They often have perfectionist traits. So not only do they want to be doing well, but they also want to be supporting their peers, and outing their peers can feel really, really risky. I guess another alarming area of pro-anorexia is that it shares ideas about how to keep illness secret from professionals and those who love you. And that can be really, really tricky to unpick, because there are lots of tips and tricks that young people and adolescents and adults engage in to keep professionals at bay, because the concept of recovery is so scary. And I think that's something to hold on to. People aren't engaging in these communities because they're fun and they're jazzy and they're sexy, although they are alluring. They're often engaging in them because they want a place of safety. So what happens is sometimes you get a clinician over here saying, you know, I'm going to help you, I'm going to make life better. And the young person is feeling, this is too scary. I can't do this. I need people to help me. But often help when you're ill doesn't look like help when you're well, because the help when you're ill is kind of, I just want to feel safe and take this pain away. And often that can look like eating less and less, when actually, when we're well and healthy, we know that being well involves people caring for us and supporting us to eat. So we often see this split and divide. And when that's reinforced in dynamics which are already really tricky, it can become harder to infiltrate helpfully as a professional, and we can get this gulf between the young person and the professional who's helping them. One of the more alarming things about pro-anorexia is that it just doesn't happen online. So for example, there are WhatsApp groups that young people can join. So if as a parent you've got your controls locked down, you're checking their history, you're thinking all is good and safe and well, there is no guarantee that they're not accessing pro-anorexic content in another way through, for example, WhatsApp groups who are championing goal weights, dietary tips and techniques again, which I think is a lot harder for parents to monitor. And also parents aren't cued into that because we're constantly drilling home, parent, lock down your internet use, and people aren't thinking about other apps that they might be using. Another thing that's particularly alarming with regards to social media use and pro-anorexia is that what some research has indicated is that there are anorexic or pro-anorexic coaches, which again reinforce ideas around losing weight and becoming thin. And actually what's been identified is that some of those coaches are older men using it as a way to groom vulnerable young people. When we're thinking about pro-anorexic use, it's really complex. It's not just young people or very unwell people going online to talk about illness and ways to maintain illness, but actually young people, being very young, vulnerable people, are being exposed potentially to being groomed, and they're clearly already vulnerable when they're struggling with their low self-esteem and their body image. So I think for me, when we're thinking about kind of online communities, it's so much more complicated than learning tips and tricks on how to be thin. I think before pro-anorexia all started, there was a general consensus within the research population that there is a negative impact on media images and mental health and well-being and perceptions of self. What research has since shown is that when you expose young people who are well and healthy to pro-anorexic images, that there is very significant impact on the way that they perceive themselves and their self-worth and their body image. And for me, that's really striking. Now, I think research needs to understand that better around how the information is being accessed. Again, you know, I think that it's so different from traditional media. In the past, we may have looked in magazines, we may have seen billboards, we might have read things in books, but we were always able to shut that down. And now we can't do that. And if we think about our children and young people accessing their social media and doom scrolling, they are seldom looking at their phone for just 2 minutes at the time. And for me, that's really alarming, because you couple that with an algorithm which is so easily tripped into showing you more and more of the same stuff. Pro-anorexia isn't just affecting our young people who have eating disorders, it's potentially affecting young people who are at risk of developing eating disorders, or are even pre that phase, and it's becoming part of their norm and their culture. But before we worry about a moral panic or a crisis online, I think it's really positive and important to think about what policymakers are doing to protect our young people and children who are using the internet on a daily basis. And one of the protective factors which have now come into play is the Online Safety Act in 2023, and it really pushes platforms to take accountability and responsibility for the content that their users are putting out there. And for me, that's particularly important because 91% of people who have an eating disorder report that they have come into contact with pro-anorexic content. And so if we can moderate and manage online communities better, we have a better chance of supporting people in real life, day-to-day interactions. So whilst on the surface, pro-anorexia looks like it's a community that happens out there online, the real reality is that the chances are it's probably happening in our homes. And just to put some perspective on that, if we think about the rates of eating disorders being somewhere between 1.4 and 3.4 million in the UK, and we were to zoom in maybe on a teenage population, that would be one child in every 50 has an eating disorder or is at risk of developing an eating disorder. So if we think about those big schools, like that's quite a lot of children that we're starting to think about. And so those children live potentially in my home or your home. This stuff isn't happening somewhere in another country. This is happening right here, right now. And it's our duty of care as professionals, as parents, as policymakers to start protecting our children from this damaging content, which has the risk to harm but also kill. Hi, my name is Linnie Telford. I am a Chartered Clinical Psychologist. I specifically work with children, adolescents and young people. I have specialist trainings in systemic practice, EMDR and the assessment of neurodiversity. You can find me on Instagram at The Virtual Psychologist and on my website. This video was made in collaboration with Mindfriend. They are an educational digital platform combating misinformation of mental health through accredited professionals. See you in the next video.